Hello, my friends. This is Bradley J. Show, and it's Friday. It's not really a plan, but it seems like Rich Rubino joins us every Friday now to talk about something interesting, as he is a political historian and not just a presidential historian, but a United States political historian. And today we're going to talk about negative campaigning and dirty tricks.
Yes.
There was an article that came out. We almost did it before, but we didn't because it was President's Day. Probably
Yep.
we figured we ought to do presidents, but now it is negative campaigning and dirty tricks. And my first question is: people think things are gruesomely dirty now. Are they any dirtier than ever? Or were there spots where it wasn't dirty, and then were there spots where it was way more dirty? And where does the place we are now stack up to dirty trick eras historically?
Yeah. I mean, just like anything else. There are nuances or vicissitudes. It goes back and forth. But if you go back and just in terms of American history, you go back to the 1800 election. This was between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. This was prior to the 12th Amendment when the president and the vice president were essentially whoever became president and who won the most electoral votes or became vice president won the second most. So you had John Adams, who was a Federalist, who wanted a more expansive federal government. Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, who wanted a more lean, limber government. So essentially, you had Jefferson running against Adams. In that race, you had a guy named James Callender, who was a pamphlet. He had his pamphleteer on behalf of Thomas Jefferson, and he basically suggested that John Adams was an hermaphrodite character, kind of half man and half woman. So I mean, this has happened really.
Is there any truth to that?
I don't think so. I think that a lot of this, like anything else, was just hearsay, and you could basically make something up back in that time period. You could basically make up just about anything, and that's essentially what was going on. And Adams had his own. And back then, by the way, the media didn't make any semblance they're supposed to be neutral. Essentially, Jefferson had his own paper, Adams had his own paper, the different political parties had their own paper, and they would basically go after the other person. So, I mean, this has really happened since time immemorial. You can go back to the Roman Republic for negative ads, but you've always had this. And if you go back, for example, Benjamin Harrison in 1888 barely won the election, and Benjamin Harrison was a very religious guy. And the day after the election, he said that Providence basically won this election for me. To which Matthew Kay, who was his political advisor and really orchestrated his campaign, the next day, Providence had nothing to do with it. If you know how many people probably could go to the penitentiary for what they did to get Benjamin Harrison elected in terms of dirty tricks, you would have no idea. So essentially, it's
Before you go on
throughout American history.
You talked about. I don't want to get too far away from what you said before I bring this up. It was the Jefferson had his paper, Adams had his own paper.
Oh,
so this idea that there's bias is not a new one.
It's just that now a lot of people there are newspapers that will say that they're unbiased. But first of all, being unbiased is something that is immutable. It's absolutely impossible. When you're choosing what you're going to emphasize in a story, you're showing a certain bias. No thinking human being can be completely unbiased. You can strive to be unbiased. It's like the United States striving for a more perfect union. You're never going to get a perfect union, but you strive for a more perfect union. And consummately, it's essentially the same thing here. You can always strive to try to be as unbiased as possible. But for example, if you're talking about the candidates and say there are 11 people running against each other, you're probably not going to give, and you have a minute and 30 seconds for a package. Chances are you're not going to give all 11 candidates the exact same time. You're probably going to give one candidate 20 seconds, and one candidate's probably not even going to be mentioned. That's just kind of the way. That's kind of the way of things, I guess. But if you go back in history, they literally had pamphlets and newspapers that the political parties essentially orchestrated, that the political parties were basically spearheaded. You don't have that so much anymore, but you do have people who essentially say that, yes, we try to be unbiased, but unbiased is basically impossible.
All right. So let's get into some dirty tricks.
Dirty tricks, yes, absolutely. And that's been going on essentially for time immemorial as well. But it's interesting in terms of dirty tricks. The one I think is probably the most fascinating one. And this goes back to, have you ever heard of a guy named Dick Tuck?
Yes.
You've heard of him? Yes. Awesome. So Dick Tuck was essentially a charity trickster for the Democratic Party, and he really got his name working for the John F. Kennedy campaign. But before that, in 1950, Richard Nixon was a young upstart member of the United States House of Representatives running against Helen Cahagan Douglas. Helen Gahaga Douglas was running. They were both running for an open Senate seat. And during that race, Dick Tuck was running the college Republicans and was in charge of the college Republicans in the University of California. I'm sorry, he pretended he was in charge of the college Republicans. He was really he was really a Democratic dirty trickster. So what he did is he invited Richard Nixon under the auspices that he's a Republican and I want to have the Republican candidate come speak to the students. So he invited him to come speak. And what he did, and this is, remember, he's a dirty trickster. Remember, he's a Democrat now. I know it's a little abstruse, but remember, he's a Democrat here. So he basically reserved the biggest room on campus, upwards thousands and thousands of seats. Never told anybody about it. Never advertised the event. So Nixon comes thinking there's going to be 3,000 or 4,000 students cheering for him. He comes. There's about 7 people there, and Dick Tuck gets up there, and he gives a 30-minute now oration introducing Richard Nixon. Nixon's sitting there saying, what am I doing? There's 7 people here. He's giving me a 30-minute introduction. And at the end, and he said, and Congressman Nixon has agreed to address only one issue today, international monetary policy, which Nixon was not prepared for. So that was Dick Tuck. And that was really the best, if you will, of Dick Tuck. Now, he continued to do this. Again, he was really a thorn in the side of Richard Nixon. For example, when it came to Nixon-Kennedy debates in 1960, he hired an elderly lady to come up to Nixon. Back then, all the media would come up. So all the media would come up and they basically ask questions to Nixon and Kennedy. So an older lady comes up to Kennedy and goes up to her and exacerbates to Nixon, don't worry, son, you'll do better next time, to try to bring down the confidence that he had and everything else. But this is actually partly where Nixon got the idea that he would want to do dirty tricks. He used to say that Kennedy tried to do all these dirty tricks essentially on me. And that's really kind of got the impetus in his head, which eventually led to Nixon having his own dirty trickster.
Did Roger Stone go back that far?
I'm going there right now. Roger Stone. Yes. Okay. The Stone Cold Truth. Roger Stone was Nixon's Dick Tuck.
I see.
And Roger Stone was a very young man. And eventually, Richard Nixon, 1968, he wins the Republican presidential nomination. And Roger Stone, of course, works in that campaign. And partly what they try to do, and this wasn't a dirty trick, but that was the year there was absolute chaos and acrimony at the Democratic National Convention. So Eugene McCarthy, senator from Minnesota, anti-Vietnam War candidate, won in the primaries, but lost at the convention despite Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, supporter of at least a tepid supporter of the Vietnam War. This was despite the fact that Hubert Humphrey had only participated in one primary, South Dakota, and come in third. So the Humphrey people got Humphrey the nomination, and the McCarthy people were irate. There were protests in Grant Park in Chicago, protests everywhere, and you had people, you had the cops coming in with the horses. So Nixon ran a campaign and showed all the rioting, and then they have the picture of Hubert Humphrey essentially smiling, like Hubert Humphrey doesn't really care. He's insouciant, and Hubert Humphrey's just kind of happy about all this. They later retracted the ad, or they didn't run it, but the point is that essentially the damage was done. So Nixon learned that he needed to have his own dirty trickster. And one thing Roger Stone tried to do with Nixon, once Nixon became president, they were looking to 1972 when he runs for re-election. They're saying, how do we hamper our opponents? And the first one they looked at was George Wallace. So George Wallace had run. He had been the governor of Alabama. He was a once and future governor of Alabama. And in 1964, he becomes governor of Alabama. At the time in Alabama, you cannot secede yourself. So he did not run for re-election in 1966. He got elected in 62, did not run in 66. 1968 ran essentially as the American Party candidate and took away a lot of southern states like Arkansas, Mississippi, and Alabama that would have otherwise gone for Nixon. So they wanted to bloody him up as much as possible. So they orchestrated a campaign. George Wallace decides he wants to be governor of Alabama again in 1970, so he runs. And under Alabama law, you have a runoff. So if nobody garners 50%, then the two top candidates run against each other. And in George Wallace's case, what they did in the runoff to try to weaken him and to try to basically eviscerate him is they gave illegal contributions to his opponent, Albert Brewer, to try to get it so the Brewer would actually beat Wallace. It backfired, and Wallace actually landed up winning the governorship in 1970. Then in 1972, he did run for president. Of course, he was in Maryland at one point, and he actually got shot, and that basically took him out of the race. So what would they try to do? They try to do everything they can to try to bloody up every other candidate. One of them was Edmund Muskie, the senator from Maine. They wrote a letter to the Manchester Union leader, basically someone in the letter, and I'll make this as condensed as possible, basically complaining that Ed Muskie's wife was had many problems, and that he had called Canadians Canucks, which is a pejorative. So Ed Muskie gets up there in New Hampshire, and it looks like he's starting to cry because he's basically defending himself against William Loeb, who was the editor of the Manchester Union Leader, for publishing all this stuff. And people don't know whether he's actually crying or whether he is, or whether it's just the snow coming down, because it was a snowy day that day. But the damage was done, and George McGovern, who was a 200-to-1 long shot at the beginning, Richard Nixon's first choice to run against, he thought that would be the weakest candidate, lands up garnering the nomination. He did the same things to other candidates who ran that year, Hubert Humphrey, Terry Sanford. But so Nixon had his guy, and John F. Kennedy had his guy, and they were both very good at dirty tricks. And I'll say one more thing for Kennedy in terms of a dirty trick, that actually back in the 1960 campaign, he's running for the Democratic nomination. And in West Virginia is 95% Protestant. He has to win the West Virginia primary to prove to Democratic voters that he can win a state that is predominantly non-Catholic. Kennedy does not want to be the Catholic candidate, and he does not want to have that pejorative of the Catholic candidate. So partly he did that. He was very diligent. He did all the hard work. He did the shoe leather campaigning. But there was another factor too. Hubert Humphrey, who was his opponent, Hubert Humphrey did not serve in World War II. That was because he had a hernia, and he actually went to his exam, and they would not accept him to serve in World War II. So what Robert F. Kennedy, who was running the West Virginia effort for John F. Kennedy, did is he hired he sent out Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. And Franklin Roosevelt, because of his New Deal, was extremely popular in the state of West Virginia, to go around the state and start a rumor that Hubert Humphrey was a draft dodger. He was not a draft dodger, or that he had essentially told the draft board that I want to be a political organizer instead. So he started this rumor all over the state of West Virginia, and then eventually it got back to John F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy basically said they did it without my knowledge, and I completely disavow it. But the damage was basically done. Toward the end of that campaign, Hubert Humphrey literally took out a second mortgage on his house to try to win the state of West Virginia, but it did not work. And the Kennedy's campaign, Robert F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy, landed up winning the state of West Virginia the day of the primary. So the story is that Merrill Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey's wife, actually saw Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy went up and tried to shake her hand. And Merrill Humphrey supposedly said, I didn't know whether to shake his hand or whether to punch him in the face. But the damage was done, and Hubert Humphrey became a loyal foot soldier in Kennedy's New Frontier, and basically wrote the Peace Corps legislation. But so that's something very interesting. Yes.
Was John F. Kennedy's father involved in any of the dirty tricks? Because he was not a squeaky clean dude, as I understand. No. So was he? And if he was involved in dirty tricks, was it just early on in his pre-presidential runs, or was he involved in dirty tricks in his presidential runs?
Oh, he in the presidential run, and also before this presidential run as well. And part of that was actually, if you go back to his first congressional race back in 1946. So there were a litany of candidates that were running for the Democratic nomination. It's an open seat. And one of the candidates was named Joe Russo. He was a city councilor in the city of Boston. So what Kennedy's father did, he found another guy named Joe Russo, which probably isn't that hard in that district in Massachusetts. And he's a custodian, and he basically said, will you let us put your name on the ballot? So he said, okay. And the other Joe Russo let him at the very end. They got the signatures. They got his name on the ballot. And then voters who were going to vote for Joe Russo saw Joe Russo and voted for Joe Russo. But there were two Joe Russos, so they basically split the Joe Russo vote. And that benefited Kennedy. And Joe Russo later said that there was really no recourse that he had, because everything the Kennedy campaign did was essentially legal. But that's essentially partly how John F. Kennedy won his first congressional race. And that was orchestrated by the father.
That's kind of genius.
Oh, absolutely. And other people have tried this too, by the way. Dick Gephardt, who was the minority leader from Missouri, at one point the Republican Party found somebody else by the name of Dick Gephardt and decided to put his name on the ballot. He never actually went anywhere. There was another example, actually. There was a stockroom supervisor named John Kennedy. And this is when John Kennedy was in the United States Senate. So he decided to essentially put his name on the ballot. He had one contribution. He's running for Treasurer and Receiver General in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He had one contribution, $300 from his mother. He decides he'd put his name on the ballot. And guess what? He gets elected because a lot of people think it's the same John Kennedy.
Wow. And back to Nixon. I had two questions. Number two is Watergate was a dirty trick, right? It was. Nixon. One of Nixon's. Nixon had no problem with that because he had been dirty tricked early in his career. He wanted to do more dirty tricks. He had no problem with that. So what was the actual dirty trick that was being attempted? What were they trying to do? Yeah. The break in. What was the long game on that? What was the reason for it?
Yeah, there were a couple of Watergate is really a series of different things. You say let's use the word Watergate because people immediately think of the hotel. Nixon actually never in his life said that he never actually visited Watergate, by the way. He was never actually at the Watergate Hotel, but it's just kind of an umbrella term. There were a litany of dirty tricks. One of them, essentially, what they were trying to do, called the Plumbers, they tried to break into Daniel Ellsberg, a psychiatrist's office. That ended up failing. They also tried to go into the Democrat.
Why?
To try to
want to break into why do they want to break into the psychiatrist's office?
To try to find information supposedly about Democratic candidates, which nothing really materialized there.
Was this like the number one psychiatrist to the Democrats or something? Why this guy?
Partly, yeah.
Interesting. So Democrats would tend to go to this psychiatrist.
There was more to it, and there's a lot that we don't know because we haven't really necessarily G. Gordon Liddy and I guess you could say the Cuban compatriots didn't really necessarily tell, but that was one of the dirty tricks.
Okay.
They're trying to find information also about George McGovern. The other thing you might remember, there was called, you ever heard of the Pentagon Papers?
Yeah.
And you know who went to Daniel Ellsberg? One of the things during the Pentagon Papers. So essentially, and this is something that actually Mike Gravel, the senator from Alaska, actually read him in the United States Senate floor. The Nixon campaign was trying to kind of get back at him because was trying to get back, by the way, at was trying to essentially get back at the Pentagon Papers, because the Pentagon Papers basically revealed that the Kennedy and Johnson administration had basically misled the American people about Vietnam. So they were trying to find information about, going through this psychiatrist's office, and that landed up kind of backfiring on them as well.
Okay. Any modern dirty tricks? I'm not aware of any, but there must have been. There's like any dirty tricks in Trump Biden or Trump Hillary?
Yes. Well, there were certainly many, and there certainly were some involving, for example, there was a gubernatorial candidate, or actually ran for Congress in New York, Lee Zeldin, and what he would do, he would send out flyers, and he would say supposedly there were flyers that came out for his opponent, and they said come to the polls November 5th, but the election was actually November 6th. So those are that's something you actually see a lot. Sometimes you actually see candidates making that mistake. Rick Perry, for example, in one of his flyers gave the wrong date when he was running for president back in 2008 for when people should actually go to the polls, 2012 rather. So it happens kind of, sometimes it's mistakes. But the other thing you've really seen a lot of is the proliferation of negative ads. And negative ads, usually people say, well, negative ads, the first thing they say is, I've never listened to him. The other thing they always say is, well, there's no truth to them. There has to be some kernel of truth to them. There's some semblance of truth, because you go back to the people who make the negative ads, you go back to the campaign, they have to have some sort of a story. They can't just say candidate X robbed a bank, and then someone says, well, where'd you get this information that candidate X robbed the bank? They have to be able to say something. Usually it's a technical truth. That's what you tend to do. You tend to say something, it's a technical truth, but there's usually more to the story. Now, there are all different types of ads. There's comparative ads. For example, Jerry Brown had one in 1992 where he had Bill Clinton and Paul Tsongas, his main opponents, running against them for the presidency in the Democratic nomination. Then George H.W. Bush, the Republican, had a picture. He said they all support fast-track legislation, which essentially allows trade agreements to be decided with an up or down vote by the United States Congress without any amendments, and basically said this is going to send jobs to Mexico. Then comes up Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown essentially will not do that. That's a contrast ad. Another one he ran that year, he was for a 13%. Remember this, there's a Democrat running for president, wanted a 13% flat tax. And he had one ad where he has Archie Bunker and Meathead from the show All in the Family talking about how great the flat tax was, and they were talking about how Clinton and Bush, they only benefit the wealthy. So you go back, you talk about Brown, then you talk about Clinton. Then there are ads that are just negative. The only purpose is essentially to go after your opponent, and at the end you just say, and today we have to say, because of McCain-Feingold, you have to say paid for by, essentially this person, paid for by candidate for governor or senator. And those are usually sometimes the worst. There's one, for example, in 2002, Saxby Chambliss is running for a Senate seat against the incumbent Max Cleland. Max Cleland, who actually lost his limbs in Vietnam and was in a wheelchair. And this was when they were creating the Homeland Security Department. So that one of the things about the Homeland Security Department is Max Cleland wanted collective bargaining rights for the employees of this new department. So they ran an ad and basically had Max Cleland, Saddam Hussein, and Osama bin Laden, basically comparing the two in a sense. And it was seen as dirty campaigning, but it did benefit Saxby Chambliss in that campaign. So that's one example of one that's just completely.
So they did this just because Cleland got bargaining rights for employees.
He didn't have them yet. He was one of the supporters.
He was trying to.
Yes, he was.
They associated that with.
He was. If you're not with us, you're with the enemy. So essentially, it's basically taking something and it's going it to the extreme, and that's essentially what Saxby Chambliss was doing in that political campaign.
Jeez. By the way, I'm surprised that negative campaigning works anymore, because so much of it used to be based upon lack of character or dishonesty, and now no one seems to care about character or dishonesty. It used to be based on, he cheated on his wife. No one cares about that anymore. You can be a monster as long as you're going to do what I want to do. I don't care how horrid you are. That it seems to be the case now. I'm surprised that negative campaigning works so well.
Well, a couple of things interesting, and this shows how far we've come. Back in 1977, there was back when Mario Cuomo was running against Ed Koch in New York, and Mario Cuomo probably had nothing to do with this, but there were dirty tricksters within the Cuomo campaign that sent out flyers that said on them, "Vote for Cuomo, not the homo." I mean, imagine somebody trying that today. People would say, "He's gay. Okay, I don't care." Right. But back in the late 1970s, that was certainly actually an issue. The other one they did when George W. Bush was running against Ann Richards in 94. Ann Richards, the incumbent governor, had a 60% personal approval rating on Election Day. There were rumors and there were mailers that were sent out that Ann Richards was a lesbian. Now, if you did that today, there probably wouldn't get much credence, but they were sent out. I mean, obviously you went to the Bush campaign, they went to Karl Rove, and they all vehemently denied it. But the fact of the matter is that the rumors had essentially been sent out. But part of why this works, and it's part of the way our brains operate, our brains basically gravitate and we remember certain things that are negative. I don't know if that means we're just negative human beings in general, but
maybe it's a survival technique.
We do go to that.
A survival skill that you got to remember the dangerous stuff to survive.
Fight or flight.
Maybe that's it. But cheating on your wife, no one cares about that anymore. That used to be a career killer, right?
Fascinating about that. Yeah, Adlai Stevenson, first of all. Adlai Stevenson was governor of Illinois, the Democratic presidential nominee, 1952, 1956. And the fact that he was divorced was a major issue against him. There was actually a Happy Days episode, believe it or not. And Fonzie got up there and Fonzie says, "Hey, you need to vote for Eisenhower." Then Richie gets up there and talks about why you should vote for Governor Stevenson. And then he's talking to his father, Tom Bosley, and his father basically says, "How can you support Adlai Stevenson? Adlai Stevenson can't even keep his own family together. How can he keep his own country together?" Now imagine that actually being something today. We have a president, for example, folks like Donald Trump, who was on, his third wife, and it became almost very much a sub issue. It wasn't really a major issue in the campaign. You had John Kerry being divorced, Ronald Reagan divorced, John McCain divorced. These aren't major issues necessarily today, but back in the 1950s, they were. And in 1964, Nelson Rockefeller is running governor of New York, the early front runner, the establishment candidate, and he had been divorced. And right around the California primary, it turns out that he was getting remarried, and this became a huge issue against him and put Barry Goldwater over the edge, winning California, which was winner take all in the Republican primaries. And Barry Goldwater ends up partly getting the nomination. Interestingly, Barry Goldwater actually had a dirty trick played against him because people in the Rockefeller campaign basically said, basically suggested that Goldwater, if he were elected, would not be trustful with the H bomb.
Right. That's the thing I remember about Barry Goldwater as a kid. I remember Barry Goldwater and that he was bad because he would blow up the world.
There are a couple of things about this. First of all, there was an ad that ran one time. Lyndon Johnson's campaign ran it. And it was really kind of risky that they would do this because he was ahead literally by like 50 points. Goldwater, all Republicans were running away from him. George Romney's running for governor, re-election as governor of Michigan. He's sending out flyers showing how is he a Republican, how you can vote for him and vote for Lyndon Johnson, how you can essentially cross-pollinate, if you will, vote for a Democrat for president, vote for me as a Republican. Everyone was distancing himself from them. But Johnson ran an ad, and there's a 4-year-old sitting there playing with a flower, saying 1, 2, 3, 3, 3, and then all of a sudden you see a nuclear bomb go off. And then you say Lyndon Johnson comes on and says, "These are the stakes. To live in a world where for all God's children, we can either live or we must die." Ran one time, made an impact, and people see Barry Goldwater that way. But yeah. Goldwater didn't help himself.
That's still my immediate reaction. Now that you spell that commercial out, that is what I saw as a kid. Boom.
It ran one time, but it was so much coverage of the ad.
Right.
It wasn't the ad itself. It was the coverage of the ad. And that's part of what political ads is. People may not see the ad, but they're going to hear it all the time on the news. And Goldwater, at the convention that year at the Cow Palace in San Francisco, California, people thought he's going to go up there and he's going to disavow Barry Goldwater. And he's going to basically say, "I'm a moderate." He gets up there and he says, "Let me remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. But let me also remind you that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." And people said, "Oh my gosh, he's going to run as Barry Goldwater." And he did that. And then a month later, there were overtures, Eisenhower, everyone else in the Republican Party says you have to moderate. So he actually went to Republican Party, went to a unity meeting, did moderate his message a little bit, had a political advertisement where he's with Eisenhower, and basically Eisenhower is actually giving him the green light. Eisenhower, who had been a moderate, who Goldwater had criticized, calling his policies a quote-unquote dime store New Deal. But Goldwater basically said, "Well, it's not true that I want to cut Social Security. I don't want to eliminate Social Security. I don't want to privatize it." And he said, "And I don't want to get the United States out of the United Nations." But people still saw Barry Goldwater, partly for that ad, partly for that statement, and partly for certain jokes that he had made, like, for example, saying that he wanted to lob a nuke into the men's room at the Kremlin, which certainly did not help him in 1964. So consequently, Lyndon Johnson won 61.6% of the vote that year, and Goldwater only won one state out of the Deep South, and that was his home state of Arizona.
Wow. It's interesting to hear you talk about the issues back then because things haven't changed that much when it comes to issues. You see the same things popping up. Are you going to get rid of Social Security, Medicare? You're going to privatize it. Taxes up or down, trade policy this way or that way, militant or not, stay in the UN or NATO or not, same basic stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
And the pendulum goes back and forth. All right, here's a question. What decides which way the pendulum swings? Like, is it just predicated on how far it was over that way? That decides how far it swings that way, just like physics.
Yeah, it's like every reaction is an equal and opposite reaction, like Newton. Yeah. The third law of physics. There is a lot to that, and usually, though, what happens is once a party nominates somebody that is somebody who loses, who's either on the far left or the far right. For example, in 1972, they nominate George McGovern. George McGovern only wins Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. So what happens in the next election? The pendulum swings to the other side on the Democratic Party, and the Democrats, instead of nominating somebody like Mo Udall or Fred Harris or somebody who was from the government wing, they nominate Jimmy Carter, a Southern centrist, Southern Baptist, born-again Christian, and he lands up winning. Barry Goldwater, 1964, from the far right. By 1968, the party has basically three choices. There's the liberal wing, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York. There's a conservative wing, Ronald Reagan, the governor of California, and then Richard Nixon, basically in the middle there, somebody who had been seen as someone of a moderate or a liberal, but moved somewhat to the right by campaigning for Goldwater in '64 when other Republicans wouldn't. So he gets the nomination in 1968. So that's 1968 with the Republican Party. That's usually what happens. Another example, the Democratic Party, 1984, Walter Mondale wins 1 state. Mike Dukakis, 1988, wins 10 states. So by 1992, after losing twice and basically having that liberal imprimatur just kind of tattooed on their head, they nominate one of the more conservative Democrats in terms of Bill Clinton, who says he's a new Democrat, and wants to reform welfare, and literally goes a couple of days before New Hampshire, goes back to Arkansas to supervise a execution, for example. So the pendulum always swings usually back to the center.
All right, so let's wrap it up with the upcoming elections cycle. Maybe it started already.
Oh, it started.
Didn't really see any. Don't really see any dirty tricks yet. I mean, what the stuff that Trump says about DeSantis isn't really dirty tricks. I mean, it's negative campaigning, but not a dirty trick. You haven't seen any dirty tricks yet, right?
You haven't seen any actual dirty tricks. What you have seen, seen him essentially on his True Social network, basically endorsing a charge that Ron DeSantis had basically been at when he was a teacher right after college.
Yeah, that's a dirty trick. That is a dirty trick.
It's not that he's taking information somebody else had, and he basically looking at the photograph and said, "Oh, you wouldn't do this, Ron." I think part of that is his strategy. He sees Ron DeSantis as the most redoubtable opponent right now. And usually when there's somebody that's at his level, at least in polling, he does everything he possibly can to try to make that person dissipate.
Yeah.
If somebody else comes up, it's like whack-a-mole. He'll go after that person. So if Nikki Haley starts coming up, he'll go after that person.
That is a dirty trick, because the photo, you can barely tell it whether or not it's DeSantis. You don't know how old. You can't see his age, and anything could be going on there. Completely, it's almost like a Rorschach test. You see in the photo what you want to see, but that's that is, I guess that'd have to qualify as a dirty trick. But it's not to say that Trump's the only one that would do a dirty trick. I'm sure if the other folks can think of some, they will do that.
Or they're surrogates. Sometimes it's not the actual candidate, and sometimes it's surrogates that don't even. Sometimes it's a surrogate of a surrogate, or someone that's not even directly associated with the candidate that might actually kind of send out some of these messages. And then they come to the candidate, and the candidate might legitimately say, I don't know. And the other candidate will say, oh yeah, you don't know. Of course you were part of this whole thing, but you don't know where the thing is actually, where the impetus actually began. And if, like any other dirt, like anything else, you have to not be able to kind of trace it directly to the candidate.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff comes out and the candidate says, what's going on. And sometimes that might not be apocryphal.
Trump's usually good at nicknaming people in a way that is effective and negative. But Ron DeSanctimonious is a bad choice, because most people don't understand what that means. Like, that's not a usual Trump nickname. It's got to be more primal than DeSanctimonious. He needs to come up with something else. I think somebody told him that one, and he said, "Yeah, I'll do that." But he's going to get a new one soon, because that's not very hard hitting.
The interesting thing about that one is he delivered it before. This was before he was in Florida, and he was campaigning basically for Marco Rubio, for the ticket Marco Rubio running for Senate. And he was at a rally, and Ron DeSantis is running for re-election as governor. Ron DeSantis is not at that rally. So Ron DeSantis is basically separating himself somewhat from Donald Trump. And this is before, generally the rule is if somebody's running for re-election, you're in that party, you don't criticize them until essentially the day after. When George W. Bush was running for re-election in 1998, you saw folks like Steve Forbes and John McCain talking about, oh, he's been a great governor for the state of Texas. Bush wins re-election, then you go after the person. He did it before Ron DeSantis was actually reelected, and that's considered almost impolitic, if you will. And it's fascinating that Donald Trump chose that, but it did, I think, shows that he wants there to be somewhat of a, he wants there to be friction in the Republican Party in the state of Florida. He wants to see where folks like Marco Rubio, the other Senator Rick Scott, will they come out and will they endorse their governor or will they support Donald Trump? He's interestingly in the state of South Carolina, he got the endorsement of Lindsey Graham and Governor Henry McMaster, the governor of South Carolina, who was lieutenant governor when Nikki Haley was governor. Nikki Haley, now the presidential candidate, and away from and Lindsey Graham did not endorse his own colleague in the United States Senate, Tim Scott. So very interesting play in South Carolina. I think he was trying to do something similar in Florida, basically to embarrass Ron DeSantis on his home turf.
Is there any way that Nikki Haley's entrance in the race helps Trump?
Only by the fact that he needs as many candidates to run as possible. If 77 people run, they're all basically going to split the anti-Trump vote, and Trump can do exactly what he did last time. Not until his home state of New York, when he won 51%, when he won a majority of the vote, did he win a majority anywhere. All he has to win is 31, 32, 33%, just win a plurality, and there are people that will be with him till the last dog dies. Everyone else is basically trying to become the challenger to Donald Trump. He would rather have Nikki Haley. He'd rather have Nikki Haley. He'd rather have everyone else in the race. His worst nightmare is everyone basically clears the field and they say, okay, whether it's Ron DeSantis or somebody else, we're all going to support somebody other than Donald Trump because this is our candidate. Then it's a one-on-one race between him and that person, in which case it's Donald Trump with all of his supporters versus the other person who has the support of all the Republican Party. But his best case scenario, 77 people run and they all try to be the anti-Trump.
All right, one final question. We take DeSantis, and he has not announced yet. What are the pros and cons of announcing? I just know one on each side. As soon as you announce, you become a bigger target. However, if you delay, you might sacrifice and miss out on some funding. Are those two accurate? And what are the other factors that go into that decision?
I think the main factor, and I think he's copying what George W. Bush did in 1999. Bush went through an entire legislature, but got reelected, won 68% of the vote, then went through an entire legislative session. And during that legislative session in Texas, when people asked him the questions, he'd say, well, I'm focused right now on my job. Then after the legislative session in Texas, this legislature meets 90 days every 2 years. They don't have that much to do, essentially. Then he essentially starts running for president. So he says, right now I have to focus on my job. Meanwhile, while he's saying he's focusing on his job, which is the same thing Ron DeSantis is doing, there's speculation. When will he get in? When will he get in? And he's getting a lot of free media time. He's getting free media time because of his name recognition and because people are saying, who is this guy that in some polls is tied or beating Trump in certain states? He gets out of that. He gets into the race. All of a sudden, he's just one of a litany of people running against Donald Trump. Also, he's selling his book now. He just wrote a book. It's the #1 bestseller already. And he can make a lot of money on this. And he can use it as essentially a campaign blueprint. Now essentially he says the same thing Bush did in 1998. He said, look, I just got reelected overwhelmingly. You say George W. Bush, just like when George W. Bush's case was, I won relatively narrowly in 1994. Then in 1998, I was essentially, I won in a landslide. DeSantis is going to come. He's going to say the same thing. He's going to say, the first time I ran, I won by less than 32,000 votes. Second time I run for re-election. I got the biggest victory of any Florida governor since Bob Graham in 1982, and the biggest of any Republican in history of the state. So that's basically what I think his strategy is going to be. Just basically say, well, look at what people in Florida think about me. Look at how I was reelected. But in the meantime, he's getting so much free media time right now. Yeah. And I think whether he's in it or not, he'll get a couple of days coverage, mega coverage when he actually announces his candidacy. Then essentially it's going to be he'll get coverage, and then you see other candidates running. When other candidates announce they're going to get in, they're going to get coverage. So I don't think that. I think it is certainly a strategy, but certainly waiting for the end of the legislative session certainly is something that will be very effective for him.
So free coverage and timing is very important. That's one of the reasons that people make such extreme, crazy statements on either side is to get coverage.
But those are usually the candidates on the fringes that do that.
I see.
The candidates on the fringes need to garner media attention. So they need some sort of a ploy for them to do that. And all of a sudden people are saying like, wow, this person, said something so radical. But usually when you're an establishment candidate, and Ron DeSantis has become kind of the establishment candidate, you don't say anything all that radical, at least not right now. And as you get into the general election, obviously there are certainly exceptions to this. In the general election, generally You try to speak in as many platitudes as possible. Like Thomas E. Dewey, when he ran in 1948, at one time he goes to Arizona. He goes, in Arizona, your future is ahead of you.
Right.
Well, that's hard to argue with unless the world's going to blow up.
Right.
But
together we can.
He was ahead, so he's trying to say nothing.
Yeah.
And then Harry Truman took on and said, and he said, your future's ahead of you. Well, I think your future's ahead of you, and it's not going to be with those Republicans in the do-nothing Republican Congress either. And he kind of made, hay about it. People started to say after that, Dewey doesn't really stand for anything other than he has a mustache and he wants to be president. But usually it's the candidates on the fringes that try to get as much attention as they possibly can. And obviously that's something that benefits them. And then sometimes they're just hoping that there's going to be some sort of a Hail Mary, and their Hail Mary pass is just to really go after somebody or to say something that's so extreme that they have to get media coverage for it.
Thank you very much.
One example. I'll just say one more that's fascinating. 1992, there was a mayor named Larry Agron. And Larry Agron could not get into one of the debates. But Jerry Brown could get into the debate, and Tom Harkin and other candidates could get into debates, even though Agron was some cases tied with them. So he actually went into the audience as a spectator. He's in the crowd, and he starts heckling the moderator and the fact that he's not in the debate. And they arrest him, they take him out. But next day, you know what? Larry Agron, finally, people know who Larry Agron is.
Yep. All right, Rich Rubino, thank you for another wonderful episode here. If you have a copy of your book right there to show. It's a really cool book. You don't have to buy it, but it's fun to buy. It's a trivia book. Tell them the title.
The Great American Political Trivia Challenge, 2,175 trivia questions from American politics, past and present. And there are plenty of dirty tricks in there as well.
I know it's a little early to think about Christmas, but if you're like my grandmother, you're buying stuff 10 months ahead of time, so it might want to pick it up. As far as what I'm up to, just briefly, brand new YouTube channel called Bradley J's Boston, All Things Boston. It's for both tourists want to know what to do when they come in here, and for locals alike who have just, because of workaday routines, haven't done anything. It includes stuff like the Downtown Crossing Arts Market. We'll take a look at the inside of the Old South Meeting House, the Old State House, the New State House, and restaurants as well. One of the most historical restaurants I have set up a shooting schedule for. So it's going to be the real deal. It's going to be the clearinghouse for all things Boston in the city and in the neighborhoods, and also day trips, stuff you can do by driving a day, like a glider trip in Vermont and a biplane ride down the Cape, stuff like that. So Rich Rubino, thank you very much. Anything in closing?
No, I hope it's Boston, Mass. and not Boston, Georgia. Am I right?
Yep, good call. That's right.
I actually met did meet a couple from Boston, Georgia, and I was shocked, and because I read an article about them, and they were saying that they're from Boston, Georgia, and it's right kind of near the Florida. It's near the Florida border, so that might be another project for you.
I wonder how that happens, Boston, Georgia. There's certainly no Georgia, Massachusetts. Is there?
No,
I know there's a Florida. I know you're going to say there's a Florida, Mass.
And a Washington. And a Peru.
That's right. All right, Rich Rubino, thanks a lot. We got to save something for next time.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. And folks out there, if you think that you know someone that might be interested in this, get to know Rich, share this. Share this to your town, your city or town Facebook page or whatever. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye, all. Bye,
Thank you,
Rich.
everybody.
Okay, let me end the broadcast.